So welcome everyone to the final lecture in our Egypt on the Eve of Independence Tuesday Spotlight theme. And I just want to use this opportunity to thank all of our members all over the world, our international community of members for supporting the Egypt Exploration Society. Without their support, of course, this lecture series would not have been possible. If you're not yet a member of the Egypt Exploration Society, then please do consider joining us and joining us in future events and making sure that you are receiving Egyptian Archaeology magazine as well as part of your membership. I'd also like to thank everyone that's joined us attending our Tuesday Spotlight lecture series so far, and in particular to our speakers, all of whom have been absolutely fantastic. Dr. Fatma Keshk, who spoke about the role of Ahmed Kamal in the formation of Egyptian Egyptology, Mustafa Tolba, who presented the career of Ahmed Fakhri, and Dr. Juliette Desplat, who most recently gave an account of the role played by Lord Cromer in Egyptian nationalism and independence. Thank you to all of those so far. Now, today we have a very special lecture by Professor Donald Reid, to many of you known already as the author of Contesting Antiquity in Egypt and Whose Pharaohs, Archaeology, Museums and Egyptian National Identity from Napoleon to World War I. And today, Professor Reid will be bringing these stories that we've already started to see, these narratives together, as well as some other major milestones and anniversaries, which we'll be marking in 2022. His lecture is titled Decolonization and Egyptian Archaeology from Saad Zaghlul to Nasser, 1922 to 1952. And as with all of our Spotlight lectures, you will find this event and all of our other lectures on our YouTube channel. So I would like to thank Professor Reid for joining us today, and I would like to hand over the virtual stage to him. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank Carl Graves and the Egypt Exploration Society for inviting me to speak in your series marking the centennial of the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 and the bicentennial of Champollion's decipherment of hieroglyphs in 1882. Perhaps the inauguration of Cairo's Grand Egyptian Museum, or GEM, projected for this fall, will make 2022 a landmark date in the history of Egyptology as well. Stepping down from the centennial to the decade level, one is almost tempted to become a numbers mystic. The Rosetta Stone was installed in the British Museum in 1802. Champollion's decipherment came in 1822, and he died in 1832. In 1842, Richard Lepsius launched his Great Prussian archaeological expedition. In 1882, Britain occupied Egypt, and Amelia Edwards co-founded the Egypt Exploration Fund. Edwards died in 1892. In 1902, both Cairo's Egyptian Museum and the Aswan Dam were inaugurated. And in 1912, Ludwig Borchardt's expedition uncovered the famous bust of Nefertiti, now in Berlin. In February 1922, Britain tried to undercut Saad Zaghlul's nationalist movement by declaring Egypt independent, but with sweeping restrictions. 9 months later, in November 1922, Carnarvon, Carter, and their Egyptian crew discovered Tutankhamun's tomb. In 1952, Nasser's free officers overthrew King Farouk and ended 94 years of French direction of the Antiquities Service. 4 years later, Egypt's diplomatic victory in the Suez War rang down the curtain on its European colonial era. By way of background, we can illustrate Egyptology's entanglement with imperialism during Egypt's long 19th century, from Napoleon's conquest in 1798 to the outbreak of World War I, with one image from early in the century and two images from near its end. Here's the famous 1809 frontispiece of the Description de l'Égypte, the encyclopedic work which turned France's military defeat in Egypt into scholarly triumph. In this pictographic reverie, the viewer disembarking at Alexandria between Pompey's pillar and Cleopatra's Needle gazes up the Nile, past the Sphinx and a corner of the Great Pyramid toward the famous temples of Upper Egypt. There is no hint here of Egypt's Byzantine or Islamic eras, the great city of Cairo, or pesky modern inhabitants. The picture's frame drives the imperial message home. Under a winged sun disk, a nude Napoleon, reminiscent of Apollo in his sun chariot or Alexander the Great, mows down the Mamluks. In the hero's train, the classical muses disembark from a French ship to return to their mythical Egyptian home. Down below, camels and horses bear in Oriental tribute to Napoleon's imperial monogram. In the foreground of this central scene, one can pick out three iconic trophies which Egypt would lose to the imperial West. At the center is the Rosetta Stone, with no hint here that it was already enshrined in the British Museum. The stone began its modern career as war booty 2 times over. Napoleon's defeat of the Mamluks at the Battle of the Pyramids enabled the French to dig up and collect the stone, but Admiral Nelson's sinking of the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile diverted it from its presumed destination in the Louvre to the British Museum. To its hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek inscriptions, the British added a fourth on its edges, captured in Egypt by the British Army in 1801 and presented by King George III. The stone's spoil of war story is not yet over, for Egypt has demanded its repatriation. Next to the Rosetta Stone here is the Dendera Zodiac, which the French would acquire in 1821. Viewing this zodiac in Paris several years later, Rifa'a at-Tahtawi remarked that it had, quote, enabled the French to understand ancient Egyptian astronomy. They take such things without giving anything in return, despite the fact that they are well aware of their value, end quote. In 1879, Khedive Ismail would give away Alexandria's still standing obelisk for re-erection in New York's Central Park. In 1913, Ludwig Borchardt whisked away the bust of Nefertiti to Berlin. When it went on display a decade later, there was an uproar. And as with the British Museum's Parthenon or Elgin marbles, Egypt has been trying to retrieve it ever since. While Britain and France pursued their long Egyptian rivalry, Muhammad Ali, or Mehmed Ali, if you prefer the Turkish pronunciation, and his descendants won increasing autonomy from the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul. In 1858, Auguste Mariette's mandate to establish an Egyptian Antiquities Service and museum entrenched French archaeological predominance in Egypt. An earlier attempt involving Tahtawi had foundered. In 1869, Muhammad Ali's grandson, Khedive Ismail, triumphantly hosted French Empress Eugénie at the inauguration of de Lesseps' Suez Canal. But Ismail's bankruptcy and deposition helped trigger Ahmed Urabi's nationalist revolt, which opened the door to British conquest in 1882. we can symbolize the long British occupation with images of Scottish troops occupying the Sphinx, Cairo's famous Shepherd's Hotel, and the Nile flotilla of Thomas Cook and Sons' global tourist empire. "93 years after the Descriptions frontispiece, Cairo's Egyptian Museum, inaugurated in 1902, suggests the complexity of pan-European imperialism on the Nile. Its architect was French, and the firm that constructed it, Italian. Britain's Lord Cromer held the strongest political hand, but since Egypt was still officially Ottoman, he presided over only a so-called veiled protectorate. The inscription over the portal was not in the name of the Ottoman Sultan, but of young Khedive Abbas Hilmi II, who chafed under Cromer's imperious hand. Despite the British occupation, the able diplomacy by Maspero and others kept the Antiquities Service in French hands down to 1952. Plaques on the museum facade honored ancient Egyptian gods, Egyptian rulers down through Byzantine times, and classical authors who wrote about Egypt. Additional plaques and medallions honored 19th century European pioneers of Egyptology. It was no accident that Champollion's and Mariette's French countrymen were the most numerous, or that scholars from the British Isles came in a close second. Had Istanbul not outweighed Cairo in German power politics, German scholars might have ranked higher than third place on the facade. Italians came in fourth, then one scholar each from the Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden. There were no Egyptians. Not only that, the dedication over the portal and plaques were in Latin. This no doubt pleased Maspero and Lord Cromer, who fancied himself a Roman proconsul and decorated his memoir on Egypt with untranslated Greek and Latin quotations. But who was the museum really for? Westerners or Egyptians? Not a single state school in Egypt then taught Latin. This table of Egyptian cultural institutions colonized by European directors also reflects the era's pan-European imperialism. Frenchmen directed the Antiquities Service, and the directorship of Alexandria's Greco-Roman Museum was long an Italian preserve. 5 German Orientalists in a row ran Egypt's National Library, Dar al-Kutub, and a German and then a Hungarian ran the Comité de Conservation des Monuments de l'Art Arabe and the Museum of Arab Art. Even the Swiss got into the Imperial Act, directing Alexandria's municipal library for 51 years. Upon the outbreak of World War I, Britain's purge of enemy aliens suddenly opened directorships to distinguished Egyptians, Ahmed Lutfi Sayyid at the National Library and Ali Bahgat at the Comité and the Museum of Arab Art. After Bahaket's death in 1924, however, the Museum of Arab Art reverted to European directorship under Gaston Viette, a Frenchman, for 24 years. A glaring absence in both the Descriptions frontispiece and the facade of the Egyptian Museum is modern Egyptians who valued pharaonic heritage. They were there all the time, but nearly invisible to Westerners, wearing imperial blinders and often ignorant of Arabic. In 1899, exactly 90 years after the Description de l'Égypte frontispiece had framed and claimed ancient Egypt for imperial France, the nationalist riposte on the right appeared on the cover of an Arabic children's magazine. An obelisk and column still frame the scene, but instead of Napoleon slaying Mamluks, Khedive Abbas II presides over a peaceful, pharaonic-inspired Egyptian Renaissance. Portraits of Rifa'a Tahtawi on the lower right, Ali Mubarak Pasha, upper right, and two other 19th century Egyptian scholars frame the scene, in which the sun beams down the light of knowledge on a woman who is teaching Egyptian children about their pharaonic heritage. This year's EES program is an admirable example of how Western Egyptologists have increasingly realized how imperial lenses have distorted the history of their field. Okasha Adali will speak next week on medieval Arab predecessors of Champollion. He wrote this groundbreaking book, Egyptology, the Missing Millennium, Ancient Egypt in Medieval Arabic Writings. Fatma Kishk spoke on pioneering Egyptian Egyptologist Ahmed Kamal, and Mustafa Tolba on Ahmed Fakhri. Heba Abdel Gawad discussed racist aspects of the views of the EEF's remarkable founder, Amelia Edwards. Abdel Gawad also teamed up with a cartoonist to reach a popular audience with Arabic cartoons on pharaonic heritage. Similarly, senior Egyptologist Faiza Haykal wrote the introduction to this cartoon book on the persistence of Egyptian popular sayings, despite the linguistic changeover from ancient Egyptian to Arabic. Juliette Desplat spoke to the EES on Lord Cromer's underestimation of Egyptian nationalism. That many of these EES speakers have been women reflects another great change in Egyptology in the last few decades. Back in 1965, Faiza Haykal's Oxford degree made her the first Egyptian woman to earn a doctorate in the field of Egyptology. And in 1988, she became the first woman elected president of the International Association of Egyptologists. The Ottoman Empire's plunge into World War I on the German side handed the British the opportunities to sever Egypt's vestigial Ottoman tie, declare a protectorate, and replace Khedive Abbas II with his pliable uncle, Sultan Hussein Kamil. Martial law silenced dissent. Troops poured in from all over the British Empire. Thousands of Egyptians were conscripted into a labor corps, and peasants' draft animals were requisitioned. The lid finally blew off in 1919 when Saad Zaghlul and two others demanded to present Egypt's case for independence to the post-World War I Paris Peace Conference. Their arrest and exile touched off the uprising, which turned Zaghlul's Waft Party into the leading nationalist force. In this cartoon, the Sphinx and a woman in pharaonic headdress personifying Egypt hail Saad Zaghlul as their leader. The coincidence that the Carnarvon Carter expedition discovered Tutankhamun's tomb in November 1922, 9 months after Britain had declared Egypt nominally independent, linked burgeoning Egyptian pride in pharaonic heritage to their national struggle for revival and full independence. With one or two exceptions, the academic specialists who helped Carter excavate the tomb were all British or American. Stephen Quirk, Wendy Doyen, and Peter der Manuelian have emphasized the overlooked archaeological contributions of Egyptian foremen or raises and their crews. And Hind Muhammad Abdurrahman has recently done this specifically for the tomb of Tutankhamun. Had the discovery come 10 years earlier, as with the bust of Nefertiti, half of his treasures might be scattered among Carnarvon's estate, the British Museum, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But for all its limitations, Egypt's new independence proved to have some teeth. After an epic struggle, Egypt, with the support of Maspero's successor, Pierre Lecoq, managed to keep the entire find as the glory of the Egyptian Museum. By the late 1930s, diminished prospects of taking home prized museum pieces led both Americans and Britons to suspend major excavations in Egypt for the rest of the semi-colonial era. Let's divide the decolonization of Egyptian archaeology from Saad Zaghlul to Nasser into two interacting themes: the emergence of Egyptian Egyptology as a specialized profession, and the embrace of pharaonic heritage by both the state and many of the wider public. Today, I'll pass over a third theme, the major sector of the economy that grew up with pharaonic tourism: tomb guards, excavation workers, non-specialist museum staff, guides of varying expertise, hotel staff, Nile boatmen, camel drivers, donkey boys, antiquities dealers, and souvenir makers and vendors. Almost the only Egyptian Egyptologist to have won a sliver of international recognition by 1922 was Ahmed Kemal Pasha. In the 1870s, he had studied under German Egyptologist Heinrich Brugsch in a short-lived school which taught Egyptology to Egyptians. Although Kemal eventually wangled a job in the Antiquities Service, the colonial milieu hemmed in his career. His first two attempts to revive Cairo's Egyptology school ended in failure. After World War I, Kemal pleaded with Antiquities director Pierre Lecoq, 24 years his junior, to hire Egyptians. To Lecoq's retort that few besides Kemal had shown any interest, he replied, "Ah, Monsieur Lecoq, in the 65 years you French have directed the Antiquities Service, what opportunities have you given us?" Lecoq vetoed the publication of the 22-volume Arabic Dictionary of Ancient Egyptian on which Kemal had long labored. In 1922, Kemal traveled to France to the centennial celebration of Champollion's decipherment, at which 23 Frenchmen, 11 Britons, 2 Belgians, other Europeans, and an American all spoke. but Ahmed Kemal was not invited to the podium. The subaltern could not speak. But change was in the air that very year, 1922. The double impetus of partial independence and Tutankhamun's tomb finally enabled Egypt to establish a durable program to train its own Egyptologists. Ahmed Kemal would have been its founding director had he not died a few months before it opened in 1924. Instead, 3 Europeans in a row headed the Egyptian University's Egyptology department down to 1939. Vladimir Golenishev, a Russian, Percy Newberry, a Briton, and Hermann Juncker, a German. In the wake of the Tutankhamun discovery, American Egyptologist James Henry Breasted, founder of the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute, proposed a lavish Rockefeller-funded museum and research institute in Cairo. This was imperial archaeology indeed. Americans and Britons together on its international board would have been able to overrule the French and stave off Egyptian control for at least 33 more years. Breasted could not have misread the political mood in Egypt more completely. Although Zaghlul's Nationalist Party was out of power, even the more accommodationist King Fuad and Prime Minister Ziwar turned the proposal down flat. Breasted ended up steering a Rockefeller-funded museum to British-controlled Palestine instead. Meanwhile, Egypt had rushed several young professionals off to Europe for higher degrees in Egyptology. Salim Hassan had attended Ahmed Kemal's short-lived pre-1914 Egyptology school, but had then had to fall back on teaching in a secondary school. Sami Gabra, a graduate of American missionary schools and law school in France, had already begun a legal career. But both men now seized the chance to retool for Egyptology. Gabra in Liverpool and Paris, and Salim Hassan in Paris. Coming home in the late 1920s to jobs in the Antiquities Service, they soon transferred to the Egyptian, now Cairo, University. The university sponsored both men in major excavations comparable to those funded by Western institutes or millionaires. Salim Hassan dug at the Giza pyramids, and Sami Gabra at the Greco-Roman site of Tuna el Gebel, ancient Hermopolis West. Here is 16-year-old King Farouk, shortly after coming to the throne, visiting Gabra's dig. Promoted assistant director of antiquities in 1936, Salim Hassan rallied nationalist support to try to oust his French superior, Etienne Drioton. But young King Farouk took a liking to the fatherly Drioton and made him his informal archaeological tutor and political protege. In 1939, the unlikely trio of Drioton, King Farouk, and British ambassador Sir Miles Lampson accused Hassan of corruption and forced him out of public life until the 1952 revolution. Meanwhile, Ahmed Fakhri, Abdulmunim Abu Bakr, Zaki Saad, Labib Habashi, and other promising Egyptology graduates were working their way up in the Antiquities Service or academia. When the outbreak of World War I suddenly removed Hermann Juncker as director of the university's Egyptology department, Sami Gabra became the first Egyptian to chair it, And in 1941, Mahmoud Hamza became the first Egyptian to direct Cairo's Egyptian Museum. The last Briton retired from the Antiquities Service in 1948, leaving Director General Etienne Drioton standing alone as the last European high in its central administration. Let's turn now to the development of wider Egyptian interest in pharaonic heritage. Pharaonism, derived from the word pharaoh, was already in the air well before 1922. As far back as 1829, a pyramid was chosen as the masthead symbol of the government's official journal, Al-Waqa'i al-Misriya. In 1875, what would become Egypt's leading daily Arabic newspaper chose El-Ahram, the pyramids, for its title. Pyramid and Sphinx motifs monopolized the design of regular Egyptian postage stamps from 1867 to 1914. In the first decade of the 20th century, nationalist Mustafa Kamil of the Watani Party, who died young, emphasized pharaonic heritage as illustrated by this statue of him by a French sculptor. During the national uprising after World War I, this cartoon of Saad Zaghlul implores Egypt, personified as a woman in imagined pharaonic dress, to wait until he can free her from chains held by the British lion. Zaghlul and his Wafd party inspired modern Egypt's most famous sculptor, Mahmoud Mukhtar, to carve the awakening of Egypt for the square before the Cairo railroad station. Here is national hero Zaghlul in front of Mukhtar's statue. After the 1952 revolution, the statue would be moved to the entrance of Cairo University. Mukhtar's Sphinx is stretching to stand up while the peasant woman beside him lifts off her veil. Saad Zaghlul died in 1922 and was buried in central Cairo in this neo-pharaonic mausoleum. Mukhtar cast monumental bronze statues of Zaghlul for central squares in Cairo and Alexandria. The Wafd was far from alone in its Pharaonist appeals in the 1920s and 1930s. Smaller political parties and the palace also promoted the theme. We've already noted young King Farouk's attraction to ancient Egypt. His father, King Fuad's postage stamps are thick with pharaonic symbols. In the center here, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and scribes, Thoth, is inscribing King Fuad's name in hieroglyphs in a royal cartouche. The other stamps use pharaonic motifs to celebrate the international congresses which King Fuad loved to host. In 1930, Tutankhamun was put on the £1 banknote. In the wake of the Tutankhamun discovery, pharaonic themes also spilled over into articles and cartoons in the press, poetry and prose, painting, and music. Tawfiq al-Hakim's acclaimed novel, Return of the Spirit, in Arabic, Audita Ruh, extolled pharaonic heritage. In 1939 to 1944, future Nobel Prize winner Naguib Mahfouz set his first 3 novels in Arabic in ancient Egypt. Muslims and Coptic Christians both celebrated ancient Egypt, but sometimes their specific traditions gave their respective attitudes a distinctive twist. We've already seen many examples of Muslims embracing ancient Egypt. However, another strand of Islamic thought, promoted by the Muslim Brothers and others, rejected anything to do with pre-Islamic antiquity. It dismissed it as Jahiliyyah, the age of polytheistic idol worship before the dawning of Islam. In the Quran, as in the Bible, the unnamed Pharaoh of the Exodus is a blasphemous tyrant who persecutes Moses and the Israelite followers of the one true God. On this book cover, a repulsive Pharaoh gasps at God's miracle of turning Aaron's staff into a serpent. This book cover links the Quranic verse, "Lo, Pharaoh aggrandized himself on earth," with an apocalyptic lightning flash over the pyramids, archetypical symbols of ancient Egypt. Outside Egypt, Taliban extremists in Afghanistan would later dynamite the Bamiyan statue of the Buddha, and in Syria, Islamic State fanatics would deface the ruins of Palmyra. Most Muslims, however, see such iconoclasm as a tragic distortion of Islam. In the first centuries of the Christian era, Coptic iconoclasts had similarly defaced images of the pharaohs and their gods as pagan abominations. The Coptic Museum, founded in 1908 by Marcus Samaika, however, emphasized Christian art from the Roman, Byzantine, and Islamic eras. Similarly, Cairo's Museum of Arab Art, later the Museum of Islamic Art, concentrated on productions of Egypt's Islamic era. Neither museum deterred Muslims or Coptic Christians from also expressing pride in pharaonic heritage. The Coptic Bible and liturgy preserve the last stage of the ancient Egyptian language, and Champollion's knowledge of Coptic greatly aided his decipherment of hieroglyphs. Some modern Copts began giving their children pharaonic names like Ramses or Isis. For several decades, the proportion of Copts in the among Cairo University's Egyptology graduates was far larger than that, than the perhaps 10% of Copts in the general population. Some Coptic clergymen were also drawn to the pharaohs and revived the Ankh, the hieroglyphic symbol for life, which the early church had adopted as a form of the Christian cross. There was also a change in the way the flight of Mary, Jesus, and Joseph into Egypt to escape King Herod was depicted. Medieval Coptic icons, like the one on this book, often lacked explicitly pharaonic symbols. Nowadays, however, depictions of the Holy Family's flight into Egypt freely deploy obvious pharaonic iconography. This book cover even seems to suggest that the Holy Family enjoyed the sound and light show at the pyramids. A few Copts were drawn to the divisive proposition, sometimes promoted by European colonizers, that Copts were the truest heirs of ancient Egypt. In 1918, the British author of this book hailed Copts specifically not their Muslim compatriots, as modern sons of the pharaohs. Most Copts, however, rejected special favors from Egypt's European colonizers and joined their Muslim compatriots in the fight for complete independence. A popular symbol of Muslim-Christian unity was the side-by-side depiction of the Islamic crescent and the Christian cross. On the left, note the crescent and cross on this Saad Zaghlul poster from the 1919 revolution. And on the right, the same symbolism during the 2011 revolution, which overthrew President Hosni Mubarak. After World War II, empire lost its luster compared to the nation state, as symbolized by the one nation, one vote arrangement in the General Assembly of the new United Nations. After the UK's withdrawal from India in 1947, waves of decolonization swept the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Pacific. In Egypt, the closure of the mixed courts in 1949 ended a major instrument of Western imperial privilege. Israel's victory over Palestinians and neighboring Arab states in 1948 propelled Nasser, Sadat, and the Free Officers toward the 1952 coup or revolution, which deposed King Farouk and replaced the monarchy with a military-dominated republic. The final act of direct European imperialism in Egypt was defeated in 1956 with Egypt's diplomatic triumph in the Suez War against Britain, France, and Israel. The July 1952 revolution also marked the end of formal colonization of Egyptian archaeology. Learning of King Farouk's ouster while on summer leave in France, Antiquities director Drioton knew that the game was up. In January 1953, prehistoric archaeologist Mustafa Amer, director of Alexandria University, became the first Egyptian to head the Antiquities Service after 94 years under the French. Other outposts of archaeological empire in Egypt also fell in 1951 and 52. Frenchman Gaston Viette, who had directed the Museum of Arab Art for a quarter of a century, went home in 1951 and was replaced by an Egyptian as director of the now Museum of Islamic Art. That fall, the Wafd government repudiated the 1936 Anglo-Egyptian Treaty, and this led to the dismissal of the several dozen remaining British employees of the Egyptian government. K.A.C. Cresswell, who had founded Cairo University's Islamic Art and Archaeology program in the 1930s, was among them. In 1948, Italian scholar Achille Adriani regained his pre-World War I post as director of Alexandria's Greco-Roman Museum, but in 1952, he read the handwriting on the wall and went home to Italy. Although now remembered for his pan-Arab nationalism, the first years of Nasser's military-dominated republic were both Egypt-centered and pharaonist. In 1954, the Sphinx replaced King Farouk as the national symbol on coins. In 1955, a colossus of Ramses II from Memphis was re-erected before the Cairo train station. It has since been moved to the entrance hall of the Grand Egyptian Museum, soon to open out at the Giza pyramids. In 1954, Nasser himself wrote the preface to an issue of La Revue du Caire, highlighting new discoveries by Egyptian archaeologists. These were Khufu's boat by the Great Pyramid, Sekhemkhet's unfinished step pyramid at Saqqara, and the Kamoze stela at Karnak, recounting the expulsion of the foreign Hyksos rulers at the dawn of the New Kingdom. To emphasize that young Egyptians, not Westerners, had made these finds, Nasser attended Zachariah Gonim's opening of the unfinished step pyramid of Zoser's successor, Sekhemkhet, at Saqqara. And here is Nasser coming out of Khufu's funerary boat pit at Giza. He's in the center with Kamal el-Malach on the left and Mustafa Amer, the new Director General of the Antiquities Service, on the right. In conclusion, Nasser's revolution 70 years ago, this coming July, and the 1956 Suez War slammed the door on formal Western colonialism in Egypt. Underlying issues of decolonization and post-colonialism in Egyptian archaeology, however, have persisted down to the present. These include the international black market for Egyptian antiquities, the repatriation of cultural treasures, the persistence of English, French, and German as dominant scholarly languages, the inequality of national resources for pursuing archaeology, and the conditions under which foreign expeditions work in Egypt. Among many Egyptians, pride in ancient Egypt has put down deep roots. Nasser's post-Suez turn to pan-Arab nationalism did for a time cast Egypt-centered nationalism and its frequent pharaonic component into the shade, but these came roaring back under Presidents Sadat, Mubarak, and Assisi. In international competitions, football-mad Egyptians cheer on their national team, the pharaohs. Pharaonic and Islamic monuments balance each other off on coins and banknotes. Last year's golden parade of royal mummies from the old Egyptian Museum in Tahrir Square to their new home in the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization, and the grand opening of the Avenue of Sphinxes in Luxor were over-the-top, made-for-TV extravaganzas. But perhaps even they may be outdone this fall at the inauguration of the Grand Egyptian Museum, GEM, out by the Giza pyramids. Yet if pride in ancient Egypt runs deep in both official and many popular circles, it would be a mistake to underestimate the negative associations of the words pharaoh and pharaonism for many Egyptians. Denouncing Egypt's recent presidents as pharaohs, akin to the blasphemous pharaoh of the Exodus, are fighting words, as these sour portrayals of Presidents Sadat and Mubarak suggest. After Nasser's death in 1970, President Sadat played the Islamic card, letting Muslim Brotherhood leaders out of prison and advertising himself as, quote, the believer president. This came back to bite Sadat, however, after he made peace with Israel. He was assassinated by an Islamic extremist who allegedly cried, "We have killed Pharaoh." Ironies abound. The relatively secular Nasser lies buried in a traditional Islamic funerary mosque, while Sadat, the self-styled believer president, was buried beneath the pyramid-shaped monument to the unknown soldier where he was assassinated. This made President Sadat the first Egyptian ruler since the pharaohs to lie beneath a pyramid. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that amazing presentation. That was absolutely phenomenal. And what a great way of bringing, as we talked about before, all these different anniversaries together that 2022 marks, and all those presentations that we have already had in the Tuesday Spotlight lecture series. Well, I just want to say a huge thank you. There are huge number, I can't read them all, but a huge number of questions, not questions, sorry, in the chat, but compliments in the chat saying how important this lecture was and how great it is to have seen this brought together so well in your presentation. So a huge thank you from me, a huge thank you from everyone in the chat. And as I say, the recording for this will be up online very soon. And yeah, I'll head off to Cairo and try and find out more about those things on the Egyptian Museum and send that over to you. But yeah, huge thank you for the presentation.
Well, thank you very much. It's really an honor to talk to such a venerable institution as the EES. There's nothing really comparable to it in the world.
Well, thank you. That means a huge amount. And for everyone in the room, if you're not yet a member of the Egypt Exploration Society, then please do join us. Head over to our website where you'll find lots of information about all the events and news we're doing, as well as links to join or make a donation and support the ES and what we're trying to do, which is engage people all over the world with the wonder of Egyptian heritage. So thank you again to Professor Reed for this brilliant lecture. Take care wherever you are. I know that things are improving everywhere, but take care and enjoy the rest of your summer. See you all very soon. Bye for now.